We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers Podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build a decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers Podcast. Hey everyone, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. Microgrids continue to be one of the most fascinating distributed energy technologies. And they've changed in many ways since they first came onto the scene in a big way over a decade ago. Today I have with me two people who have carefully tracked the microgrid industry, and we'll talk about those changes. They're here to answer the questions, what are microgrids now? And how will they meet the challenge of this new era of data centers, electric vehicles, and rising demand for power? Let me introduce you to them. Peter Asmus is the president of Pathfinders Communications and senior advisor of Clarum Advisory. Lisa Cohn is co-founder of Microgrid Knowledge, where she continues to provide meaningful journalism on the topic. Lisa is also the founder of CleanEnergyWriters.com. These are old friends. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think you will too if you're intrigued by the possibilities that microgrids present. Here we go. So, hey, Lisa and Peter, how are the two of you today?
I'm doing great.
I'm doing great too.
And you're both on the West Coast. Lisa's in Oregon, and Peter is in California.
But
Yeah,
Peter's
I was
not
going
in his pajamas.
That's true. And it's foggy and cool where I am. I don't know if it's like that for you, Lisa, but I'm right on the coast, so that's not that unusual.
It's beautiful here. Sunny and beautiful here in Portland.
Well, I'm in Virginia, and it is also beautiful spring day with lots of pollen, so excuse my voice. So, hey, thanks so much for joining me here today. I really appreciate it. I wanted to have the two of you on because the three of us have worked together for many years now in various capacities. And we all kind of started in microgrids roughly around the same time and kind of follow the same trajectory of analyzing and writing about this interesting technology. And I wanted to talk to you because I wanted to get some perspective from you about where you see microgrids now. Microgrids Now is, in fact, the name of the new publication I have on Energy Changemakers about microgrids. I feel like the technology, the market, the business models, a lot of things have evolved since we started. And I guess I should start by talking about when it was we all started working together. So, Peter, I think you were the first one to dive into microgrids. What was it that brought you into the industry?
Well, it started actually locally. At the time, I lived in Marin County, small town called Stinson Beach, and the next town up was called Bolinas. And people were asking, like, well, why can't we just create our own energy system? And they were talking about installing some solar. I think there were some solar bonds, and in Bolinas, there was even someone talking about small wind turbines. And so I started just looking into it, and I started finding out that, well, no, neighborhoods, it's difficult. You can't send power over a public right of way in most states and jurisdictions. You can't sell power to your neighbor. And that just got me thinking about that. And then I got hired by a company that was called Pike Research at the time. And that was in 2009. And my first report was on ocean energy. And I remember I had to do my first market forecast, which I thought was like, how am I supposed to forecast something that doesn't even really exist yet? But the second report was on microgrids, and that's the one that kind of took off because back then, of course, there was the Obama administration. There was a lot of investments in smart grid. And at that time, there was sort of a distinction between smart grid versus microgrid. I think since that time, it's more like they're seen as sort of part of the same thing. So that's how I got started. I remember doing my first microgrid market forecast and just trying to figure out how do you even do that. And to support that, we created a global database. We knew it was never complete, but at least we would get data according to different regions, different segments. We started segmenting the market, like military was really one of the early movers and various other things. And then the companies involved, company profiles. So that's how I got started way back when.
So that was pre-Superstorm Sandy, correct?
Yes, that's true.
Because I think Lisa and I, it was really Superstorm Sandy that brought us into the fold, and we came into it at the same time. Lisa, I'll let you tell the story.
Well, I don't know if this was before or after Superstorm. What year was Superstorm Sandy?
2012.
Oh, okay. So I remember writing about Hawaii's microgrids, but that was around 2014. But we did that before we had microgrid knowledge. We had a different website. I don't know if you remember this, and I was really fascinated by what was happening in Hawaii. And we ran a story, our Hawaii microgrids, our energy future, and it talked about why they worked in Hawaii and how they were going to start working across the country. But yes, Superstorm Sandy really kicked it off for us.
Yeah, that's what got, I think, everybody thinking about it, because I remember the story went that there were people in New York City or New Jersey who were seeing places like Princeton or various hospitals in the city that had lights on during Superstorm Sandy. And they were saying, hey, wait a minute, why is the rest of the city out and they have power? And that those questions started to arise then, and there was discussion about microgrids. I remember during Superstorm Sandy, I was writing for some publications that had offices in New York, and nobody could get to work and nobody could write. And I was in Virginia without any repercussion from the storm at all, had my power. So I was like getting up at 6 a.m. and just writing until 10 o'clock at night because everybody wanted stories about Superstorm Sandy and what it meant to the power system. And it was pretty exhausting. But that got the discussion going. And then, as Lisa mentioned, we had a publication called Energy Efficiency Markets at the time. And we started writing a little bit about microgrids there. And remember, Lisa, we noticed that whenever we wrote about microgrids, the traffic really spiked to the site. It was like something about that name, that concept was really attractive to people. Partly, obviously, because we had just been through a major power outage in the Northeast, but also I think that it was intriguing for other reasons as well.
Right. And at the time, we kept calling them solar plus storage.
Right.
At the very beginning, when we were writing a lot about Hawaii.
That brings up a good point, because I remember people had a lot of assumptions of microgrids. Some people assumed, all solar and battery systems are microgrids. Other people assumed a microgrid had to have some fossil fuel generation, this idea of a prime mover. I remember that in my first report, I said no states really had any policy on microgrids. But then I think it was in 2011, even before Superstorm Sandy, maybe there was, I think, another outage in the Northeast where Connecticut, I think, passed the first law about microgrids, and it was geared toward fuel cell companies because there were a lot of fuel cell companies in Connecticut. And I remember the key thing I remember about the bill is it would allow a microgrid to send power over a public right-of-way, but only during an emergency and an outage. Now, I'm not sure, those are the things I remember, because I remember my first report as well. There's really no policy framework for microgrids. They're just popping up where someone was able to get them through. I also remember that in my early interviews, when you talk to utilities, they were almost saying, well, a microgrid is basically illegal, or they wouldn't use this word, but the whole grid was set up not to allow people to go off grid. And so there was definitely a lot of tension. And I would say if you're looking at how things evolved, there are a lot now. There's many utilities deploying microgrids. Some of them have run into regulatory issues, which I think is interesting, but it's definitely shifted, although many would still argue utilities are trying to slow down microgrids deployed by third parties, including here in California, where I live.
It's funny. I remember one of our early microgrid knowledge conferences, there was a representative from the Edison Electric Institute on stage arguing that microgrids should all be regulated the same way utilities are. People were gasping in the audience because that would have just instantly killed the industry, because there's no way a little microgrid developer could possibly ever handle the kind of regulation that these massive investor-owned utilities have to undergo.
True.
Yeah, we've had quite a journey, as analysts and journalists and editors over the last, well, since 2014, over more than a decade now, looking at this industry. So I'm curious what you think is different about microgrids now, or the industry in general, than we saw initially. What's changed? What's evolved?
I'll take a quick stab at it, and then Peter can jump in with more details, which I'm sure he can provide. I'm seeing more players, more sophisticated technology, including controls, and then also different resources being added to microgrids, things like hydro and fuel cells. We're also seeing new financing mechanisms like energy as a service and a lot more mobile microgrids.
Really, really good points. A lot more sophistication, a lot more diversity in the kind of technology and what they can do.
Yeah, I would say also, so from a data collection standpoint, when I think about trying to create a model to forecast the future and collect data on microgrids, a lot of the projects when I started were R&D projects, grant funded. So you could, there was a public document somewhere you could see, or DOE started investing in smart grid / microgrid type projects. But over time, what's happened is this commercial and industrial segment, which was one of the smallest segments initially, has really grown into one of the largest and fastest growing. And those are the systems that it's hardest to get data on. So from a data perspective, because they're private industry, they're like going, why should I give anybody data on my microgrids? What's in it for me? But I think the one reason the C&I segment has grown so much is they're actually have a value of resilience internalized. So, when the grid went down for 3 days for a business, they go, wow, we lost 600 grand, $1 million, whatever. And so therefore they have an internal way to calculate, oh, well, this is valuable. I can invest in these assets. I remember a Microgrid Knowledge Conference, maybe this is 5 years ago, I want to say, that was one of the topics, but the primary value proposition of a microgrid was resilience. Yet there was no economic sort of value to that in the marketplace. It wasn't like in the old days where someone would get an adder for certain sort of attributes. I think that's one thing. I agree that, a lot more players, although I'm always amazed at how many players have come and gone. And like when I went to a recent microgrid conference, I didn't recognize some of the companies, and some of the companies I expected to be there weren't there. But there have been a tremendous amount of acquisitions, especially of controls vendors and storage vendors. First there was a lot of generator companies were buying battery companies, then generator companies were buying controls for like Generac buying. Well, they most recently bought Agito, but before that they bought Enbala, which was more of a VPP player. Kohler bought the small company called Gila Technologies, et cetera. So we are seeing some consolidation, but as Lisa said, we are seeing also more diversity of resources in microgrids, although I think solar and storage still tend to be dominant. But if you look globally, and if you look in Alaska, where I just finished this book, like Alaska has every resource in a microgrid. Of course, everybody in Alaska gets power from a microgrid, so it's the total outlier if you compare it to the rest of the U.S. So
it's the biggest state for microgrids, right? More microgrids in Alaska than anywhere else?
Well, it was, when I stopped tracking. Now, the challenge with Alaska is there's really no load growth. So you're not seeing new microgrids. Instead, what you're seeing is retrofits of existing microgrids. And I recently did a white paper where Alaska is looking to Iceland and other Arctic nations about data centers. Of course, that's the other big hype, is the latest hype about microgrids is data centers. And in Alaska, they're trying to figure out, could there be data centers integrated mainly into their what's called the railbelt grid, which is where the transmission system is, to build new load to lower costs for other customers. That's what Iceland did, but Iceland is very different than Alaska. So yeah, I'd say the latest hype is data centers. I first wrote about data centers and microgrids back in 2017. And back then, I went to a data center conference, and most people didn't even know what a microgrid was. So
Mhm.
it's evolved. Now it's more like utilities can't deliver the energy that data centers need. And so who can bring on power quicker? And people are looking to microgrids now. It'll be interesting to see how successful it is.
I wanna get into that some more in a minute. That's, I
Yeah.
think, really key right now,
Yes.
what's happening with load growth and microgrids. But I just wanna touch on a couple of things you said. One is when you mentioned that it's hard to count microgrids, how many microgrids are out there, because there's no central reporting for microgrids.
Nope.
There's no central place they have to win approval.
There's also no standard definition.
No standard definition of a microgrid. Yeah, that's a very good point. So you end up with these situations where you just don't know how many are out there. And I was talking to somebody who said to me, there are even businesses out there that have microgrids that don't know they have microgrids.
Right.
And all they know is this energy system that does this stuff for them. But if you ask them, oh, do you have a microgrid? They'd be like, well, I don't know. So it really is hard to define how many are out there, how fast it's growing.
That is true. And then is it backup generator? Is that, like there is an official DOE definition, but if you read the definition, it's still
You still
kind
have
of,
a DOE?
yeah, sweet. That's another whole question. But it also excluded off-grid systems, which actually globally are the most common form of microgrid. And then there's the issue of, is just a diesel backup generator, is that really a microgrid? And there's a lot of debate within the industry. And then there's what's an advanced microgrid, et cetera. So yeah, no, it's difficult.
Yeah, it has had traditionally a definitional problem, and it continues to have a definitional problem.
Yes. When I did my very first report, and this is the other topic that I spent a lot of time on, people were using the term microgrid and virtual power plant, even interchangeably, although VPP was much less developed. But that's just how squishy it was. It was like anything with distributed energy resources, people were trying to figure out how to describe that if they were coordinated in some way. I think what's really happening now, the other change in industry, all these things are sort of converging because you have microgrids that also could be VPPs or could be considered a DERM. So I'm just so glad I get to do a market forecast and try to draw hard lines between everything, because in my mind, everything is blurring and it really doesn't matter. It's really just relying on a more decentralized system, more DERs. And is your emphasis resilience or is it economic? Is it supporting the grid? All those things can be done with a microgrid. I always say if a microgrid sells a service back to the grid, you could say it then becomes a VPP during that time. So
Yeah.
that's all part of this definitional sort of, I guess, vagueness, you could say.
Now, also, when we first started writing about microgrids, we talked a lot about how there was no way to make enough money. And now we've got grid services, which you just mentioned, Peter, and demand response. So there's more ways for the microgrids to make money.
Yep, that's true.
Good point. They have an economic advantage for sure. Yeah, it's interesting that the customer only cares about solving a problem, right? It's us on this side, on the energy side, where we get caught up in, well, is it a VPP or is it a microgrid or is it energy and storage? But to them, it's just, I have a problem and how can you fix it?
Yep.
Right.
So I'm curious, are there any particular players or projects that, are kind of like that you'd highlight that you've been thinking about that you find really interesting? Lisa, you do a lot of writing about projects. What are you seeing
Well,
out there?
I put together a list of them. The one that we talk about a lot is Blue Lake Rancheria, which a few years ago provided electricity to some community members who relied on medical devices, and it saved their lives by providing electricity during an outage. That's one of my favorite examples. But then there's some other small ones. I love this one. It's in Oregon and called Our Table Cooperative. It's a farm in Oregon, and there's an agrivoltaics-based microgrid that's supposed to reduce crop warning from climate change, lower energy costs, provide resilience, and may even improve the taste of lettuce. So I thought
Oh, wow.
that was a very cool example. And then, of course, there's Footprint Project and New Use Energy, who are providing disaster response with mobile microgrids all over the country. And they recently started working in Ukraine, where they're keeping hospitals running. And then I would also point to Enchanted Rock, which is setting up resilience hubs. And a recent one is in Houston, which sees itself as having to step up its game on the resiliency front. They're worried about high wind and high water, heat and flooding. And then one other that I would mention is GM entering the bidirectional charging market with 8 EVs capable of bidirectional charging. And they're focusing on outage-prone regions, especially in PG&E territory. And that is a very cool use of a mobile microgrid. And as you know, my favorite topic.
Yeah, no, those are really interesting projects. One of the things I always loved in writing about microgrids is this sort of always a larger story there, as you point out, whether it's something to do with farming or community or healthcare. It's not just, we have efficient electrons flowing in this direction and they're green. It's that we've actually changed this community, this business, this institution in some way.
Saving lives, helping with crop growing. There's all sorts of great examples.
Yeah. The other use case, and I remember I did some white papers about it, is EVs. So when you think about it, microgrids are there when the grid goes down. But if you think we really start having more EVs, and in California, I think it's up to 1.7 million EVs or whatever it is. But if the grid is unreliable and people are depending on electric vehicles, that could be a major problem during a long-term outage. So I think that is another great use case for microgrids. I know even car dealerships are thinking when they have EV chargers, they could become also resiliency hubs for the greater community. So I think that's definitely one. But in terms of examples, I guess, I'm going to turn to Alaska for just two different examples. One, I've been doing a lot of writing about it and some white papers about this a microgrid in Cordova, which dates back to 1905. So it's
Wow.
a microgrid that's been operating, and it started out 100% hydro, then went 100% diesel, and now is hydro battery diesel. It's up to 75% renewable energy, and it's run-of-the-river hydro, so not large dam-based hydro. They even figured out how to do frequency regulation with run-of-the-river hydro. So it was once called the most modern grid, in the U.S. And this is the underground. They put all the power lines underground back in 2011. So way, way in advance of when other people were talking about it. And most recently, what's interesting is they added what they call an edge data center. So again, Alaska is always the opposite of the rest of the country. So in this case, this data center is just a tiny data center installed literally in the control room of the microgrid, and it'll only run when there's excess renewable energy. So it basically is taking advantage of energy that was previously wasted. So it doesn't, in this case, it doesn't build load. It just maximizes the use of renewable energy. So that's one cool project.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Wait a minute, I have to ask you about this one. This is a data center that is operating the microgrid?
Inside the microgrid by this company called GreenSpark, which claims now that it has lined up 120 megawatts of new edge data centers just in Alaska in existing microgrids without needing to add new generation capacity. See, in Alaska, these remote microgrids, there is no market to sell excess energy to because they are totally self-contained. So this company called GreenSpark has figured out this kind of unique way. Well, if you have stranded wind capacity that you overproduce, now these would be data centers that wouldn't operate 24/7 necessarily. So it's certain kinds of data processing loads, but it can do AI and some other things. That's just one example. So that's, what I think is a cool example. That's what I presented at the most recent Microgrid Knowledge Conference. And I've done a white paper also about that.
Where can people find that white paper?
You can go to the website of Alaska Microgrid Group, which I'm the executive director of, another hat I wear. So you can download it from there. It's got a foreword by the Linux Foundation, which is all about open source technology, but it talks about the history of Cordova and then this new concept of edge data centers. So while people are trying to build these huge mega data centers, there's also now a market, particularly more in emerging economies of small data centers that would just provide local data processing in the communities themselves. So that's one example.
And I wrote a story about that.
Oh, that's right.
Yes, based on your white paper. I thought that was a really interesting project.
It is. And then the other one I'll just highlight, it's another Alaska one. It's called Kodiak Island, second largest island in the U.S. It is 100% renewable energy, 28 megawatts. That's a big microgrid. But in that case, they do have a hydro dam, which you don't find a lot of microgrids that have traditional hydro dams, but you do find them in Alaska. So it's hydro, wind, and three kinds of storage. One is lithium-ion batteries. Two is a huge flywheel. During fish processing season, the flywheel is a 2-megawatt load, and apparently in the past, when that crane would go into operation, it could totally screw up the frequency. So they somehow engineered the flywheel directly to that crane. So it comes on and supports the transition when that huge load comes on, and then when that huge load drops off. And then it uses the hydro system for long duration storage. And so that's anyways kind of a cool project. That's also featured in this book that'll come out next year called Alaska Energy Innovators, which is really first-person account. So I was more of a ghostwriter, editor for that book. I did write the final chapter. But anyways, those are just two examples of really innovative projects from Alaska,
cool.
both remote systems.
Very, very cool.
Interesting.
Very cool projects.
Yeah.
So we started to touch on data centers a few minutes ago. This is, of course, the big, big topic in power right now, in the power industry, and lots of controversy. But, between data centers and electrification, it seems inevitable we're going to have a bump up in energy use. I'm curious what you think of this, how you think it's going to affect microgrids, and just in general, how you're feeling, positive or negative or something else, about the prospects of microgrids at this point.
That's two different questions.
Okay. Take either or both.
Well, I think for the data center issue, obviously resilience is super important. And that's where microgrids come in. Although I keep hearing over and over again that you need things like fuel cells to give them enough backup power so that they can run for longer than a few hours. I don't know what you're hearing, Peter, but they provide that really important resilience.
Yes. Like I said, when I went to my first data center conference in 2017, and I thought, well, these guys basically need a microgrid. Most people there didn't know what a microgrid was. And historically, data centers have relied on all these UPS systems with all these lead acid batteries and all these diesel generators. And I remember someone said at the data center, yeah, we're interested in new technology as long as it's been proven for 30 years. That's what they got. So it's ironic that data centers, which are providing these cutting edge AI and all this stuff, they have historically been slow to change the way they do things. But I think it is changing now, mainly because the investment community has put a lot of pressure on these companies to reduce carbon. So what they used to do is just buy carbon offsets. They just keep all the on-site stuff the same and say, oh, well, we're buying credits from this wind farm over here. I do think now they are more interested in clean assets, fuel cells in particular. Now, I've heard two different issues of fuel cells. One is they're very sensitive to frequency deviations, so they sometimes trip off. But there was a presentation from Bloom at this recent conference where they say that what they're doing is they're marrying ultracapacitors with fuel cells, and apparently that combination can substitute for a diesel generator, although a fuel cell can't start real fast. So I think the advantage of the diesel generator, that's why they were used as backups, is they can come on really fast. I do think, and I don't want to deal this whole question, but the hype is now that this is what's going to fuel microgrids now during this time of regulatory uncertainty and some of the policy things that are hurting microgrid cancellation of IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act incentives, and a lot of projects on pause. I know, Lisa, you mentioned energy as a service. What I heard is the vendors like Schneider Electric are saying, how can we do an energy as a service contract when we don't know what the DERs will cost right now. So how can we lock into a contract on a performance saying you only pay this much? So there was a lot of discussion how to share the risk on pricing. But that's also hopefully a temporary thing, and
Right.
people will.
Let's hope that's temporary. Back to data centers for a minute. I wrote a story that talked about all the ways that microgrids can help meet growing demand for data centers by data centers. And one of them that I thought was cool was this idea that you can construct new data centers that segregate critical and non-critical loads and then power them with microgrids that can take advantage of the flexibility of batteries to lower the energy costs and the carbon footprint. And I thought that was a very cool example.
Yeah,
That is a good example.
that is.
Yeah. And so much depends on the size of the data center, right? If we're talking about a data center in a bank, you probably could have a small solar storage microgrid that would have pretty significant impact. But, often the news is on the hyperscale, the very large data centers. And that's a whole different story because of the amount of power they need and the reliability. What I'm finding really fascinating is the movement of data centers towards on-site power. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the utility system
Right.
because it's taking too long to build the utility scale renewable power that these data centers want. So they're saying, well, we've got the resources, we'll just do it ourselves and we'll do it on site.
Right.
Whether those on-site systems are microgrids or not, again, goes down to what the definition is of a microgrid. But it does speak to the decentralization of energy. I heard somewhere that, I think it was by 2030, somewhere in there, that data centers could be using as much as 12% of our power. That could be the slice. And we know that like residential homeowners use about 30%. So that means that, wow, think about the influence data centers will have if they are 12% of the electric power used in the US. It's a massive market influence, massive influence on the grid. And if just some portion of that is going off grid,
Right.
that's going to change things quite a bit. And I think it'll encourage more kind of microgrid-like thinking if that starts to happen.
Right. One thing that we haven't mentioned is the focus on using these small nuclear reactors on site. I keep hearing about small nuclear reactors to support data centers. I haven't seen it
Yes.
happen,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of talk
I'm
about
skeptical.
it. Yeah, I know. I'm just saying,
skeptical.
I keep hearing about it.
There's talk about that in Alaska as well, not so much for just data centers, but for microgrids. And actually, there was a presentation by this company, Zendy, which talks about like a stage process for data centers where you'd start with kind of DERs and then you would top it off with small modular reactors when they actually come to market. But of course, I learned all about energy in Sacramento, which was the only community, I believe, to shut down an operating reactor by a citizen public vote. And it was mainly done on economics. And so I think my position on small modular reactors, I'm trying to be agnostic, although like Lisa, I'm skeptical, but they pencil out. But I don't know. It's probably 10 years out, when these things would be commercially viable. So I am skeptical. But the other thing about data centers, I agree, more on-site power, but it might not be an either or. Like there's a project in Australia, for example, which will have a microgrid, 100% renewable energy. I think they're going to use generators, but not use fossil fuel. They're going to use alternative fuel. So I think the other trend within microgrids and data centers is this idea of fuel flexible generators. So as maybe hydrogen comes on or biogas, you can evolve over time to become lower carbon. But this data center, which is 96 megawatts, would also be connected to the utility grid because a lot of data centers actually want two different utilities to serve them as another form of resilience. So if one utility goes down, they have the other utility. So this data center, I think, would have utility connections. I'm not sure about two because I think it's in an area where there's only one utility and a microgrid. It might not be just either or. You're going to see sort of hybrid combinations. And then the other thing about data centers is historically they never wanted to do demand response or do anything to support the grid. But I think that if they were smart, would change with modern technologies. If you have all these extra assets that often are just sitting there, and if they're cleaner energy assets, they could be monetized, and therefore that would make a microgrid more cost effective. So I think that's the other thing that we're going to see is not just data centers, but like
Yeah,
Lisa
really
said,
interesting.
there's now grid services. So you can make money, your microgrid can make money by being a good neighbor to the grid.
Another thing to point out too about the whole future prospect for microgrids is something. I just want to jump back to something you said earlier, Peter. Or Lisa, I forgot who said this now. You were talking about the difficulty that the industry is facing right now because of uncertainty about tax incentives and the Inflation Reduction Act and having a administration in Washington that is sour on renewable energy. But I think one thing to keep in mind, at least one thing I keep thinking about, is that the biggest competitor to microgrids and DERs is utility scale power.
Right.
And utility scale power is having those same problems. In fact, probably worse in terms of, because on top of everything else, there's interconnection delays that the big utility scale power projects are facing. So it seems to me we're coming into an age where we need more power, and it's harder and harder to build utility scale. Even if there are things that are tripping up microgrids and DERs a bit now, there's still sort of the easier thing to get installed quickly. And it seems like speed to market, it really is the key here, because these data center demand and the electrification demand is coming on pretty quickly. And like you pointed out, Peter, people are talking about modular nuclear, but if that's 10 years out, how is that possibly going to meet this demand that is coming on much more quickly? I guess that's why I said I'm kind of skeptical about nuclear. I don't think it's going to get there quickly enough. I think other solutions are going to jump in more quickly, more
Right.
flexible solutions.
One issue that Peter and Lisa, you didn't bring up is the tariffs.
Ah, yes, good point.
And I know that for the energy storage industry, they're really a problem. I talked to one energy storage company that said they're just going to work in Europe, but they don't want to deal with what's happening in the US right now. So I think that is a challenge right now. And
Oh,
hopefully
yeah.
that will change.
Yeah, I just actually finished an analysis looking at estimates of how much the tariffs are increasing costs of solar, batteries, and wind. It's not impacting wind quite as much because China is the number one supplier of both solar and batteries.
Right.
And also, even beyond that, Mexico and Canada, I didn't realize this, I think for wind, like 41% of the components in wind turbines come from China, Mexico, and Canada that are deployed in the US. So I was seeing that battery costs are going up as much as 35%. And that some people were estimating as a ballpark that the cost of DERs in general that are used in microgrids, a good ballpark number is a 7% increase in cost. So the IRA incentives are more like existing projects that had been planned and are now going away or on hold. And then there's more, this tariff thing. Now, of course, these tariffs are stop and go, but that uncertainty, as we've seen in the stock market, there's so much uncertainty right now. A lot of people said they're kind of like frozen, like we're not sure what we should do.
Right.
On the other hand,
Mhm.
I think on-site power, you're right, it's appealing. The other challenge, though, with on-site power is still interconnection delays. And one other concept we haven't talked about is this more idea of modular microgrids where they can be deployed quicker because they're more standardized. And in an ideal world, there would be a fast track to site microgrids that were these more modular ones that, aren't all totally customized engineering. Now, the large ones will always have to be customized and engineered, but, more 2-3 megawatt systems or 4 megawatt systems that might go into like Home Depot stores where they're all similarly sized, not exactly. But I think ideally in terms of regulatory policy, and I argued this in California when the wildfires were really a big issue, they should have streamlined and said, okay, all these systems in this certain size limit, you get fast track because we need to get them deployed as soon as possible.
Mm.
Yeah, very interesting. I think modular, standardized microgrids have been the holy grail for a while now that the industry is seen as the thing that will put this technology sort of into the mass market or if not the mass market, at least make it quicker to build these and get more of them up.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so Lisa pointed out that I asked two questions at once earlier, so I'm going to jump back and just ask one question, which is how are you feeling at this juncture? Are you feeling positive or negative or something else? If someone really says you got to say yes or no. What are you feeling? Lisa, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I mean, we covered it a little bit, but I feel like without the tariff uncertainty, without the uncertainty about the IRA, microgrids would be in a great place. But we've got that uncertainty that's slowing everything down right now when we really, really need the power from microgrids and every possible energy source.
It's like we've created this artificial obstruction. We've created policy that makes it more difficult to build microgrids and other forms of clean energy.
When they're really needed right now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would echo what you're saying. I would say at the recent Microgrid Knowledge Conference, it seemed like there was still optimism, and the data centers seemed to be like the latest cause for that optimism, where people were saying all this new loads, they need power, the utilities can't supply it. And so the only answer is a microgrid. Well, it's not the only answer, but, on-site power, which these days generally for something like a data center probably would be some form of a microgrid because you need resilience and et cetera. So I remember when Trump was under his first term, I remember writing about microgrids, and it didn't seem to impact it that much. Of course, this time he's taking much more drastic actions. I mean, he's talking about restarting coal, and even all the utilities are going, no, we don't want to do coal. That's like he's kind of living in the past, and I don't want to criticize our dear president too much. And he hates wind power too, although most wind projects are in red states. I just saw something today where actually the policies on the canceling of the IRA and the tariffs are actually hitting states that voted for Trump harder than the rest of the country in general. Right. At some point, will he back off? It's such a wild card and such a back and forth, stop and go, but that's all uncertainty. But that being said, now microgrids have been proven more generally. Like when I started, utilities to say, well, these things could blow up our grid. They could do this, they could do that. We can't control them, blah, blah, blah. I think since that time, microgrids are definitely more accepted, more mainstream, but not fully mainstream. And, I think there's reason for optimism, but I think in the very near term, there's just so much uncertainty. I think that will evolve. And it is a global market. Now, we've been kind of mainly talking about US, but globally, there's still a lot of need for it. This is a global market. And so maybe what'll happen is growth will accelerate in other parts while the US kind of sorts itself out.
Right. Perhaps Spain?
That's true. Well, that's another example of outage. That's true. So we are now hearing more issues. I remember there was even wildfires in like Norway or somewhere in the Scandinavian countries, which historically have had large centralized hydro systems. So I think interest in Europe, that might be the most interesting because that historically was not a great microgrid market. Maybe that's where we're going to actually see some of the fastest growth in the near future.
In Australia?
I just wanted to back up for a minute and add to Peter's comments about the Republicans who favor microgrids and clean energy in their states because they're bringing so much to those states. And there was the group of 21 House Republicans who wrote a letter to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee asking him to preserve the credits. That's a lot of Republicans.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, that's true. It's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. So the IRA isn't dead and gone yet. Those tax incentives are still on right now. So there's hope.
Yeah, right. Yes. But it does create uncertainty.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the good news is if you see the costs that come down so much when you see all the charts, of course, now there's a temporary blip, but over the long term, these trends will still continue to flow. And I don't see coal coming back. I think that the bigger question is natural gas. That's the one policy shift. And of course, microgrids can use natural gas with fuel cells. They can reduce emissions, and that can be part of the mix. I mean, the beauty of the microgrid is you can have diverse resources. And I mentioned earlier, Alaska, you even have geothermal microgrids. You have now hydrokinetic technologies being explored in microgrids. I think the other thing is that the controls, the brains, the thing that orchestrates the microgrids, those technologies have improved dramatically now using AI and being able to do those grid services as well to increase the monetization. So all of those things are still very positive.
There's a lot of positive.
Yeah.
And a lot of need.
True. That's why I'm now throwing away my microgrid t-shirt. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, hey, this has been a really, really good discussion. Thank you so much, Lisa and Peter. You are just incredible guests to have on this show, and I hope you come back again.
I'll be back.
I'll be back too.
Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers Podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.